Let's talk about cameras. First, some general terms. Different kinds of cameras. This is what's called a rangefinder camera. The ones on this page are film cameras, but the terms apply to digital or film cameras. This is what's called a rangefinder. The rangefinder usually has a separate lens system from the viewfinder. So there's sometimes parallax issues that you need to overlap the viewfinder with what the lens sees to get an idea of what you're taking a picture of. This is a typical single lens reflex camera. It's called a single lens reflex, and the digital counterpart of that is a digital single lens reflex, an SLR or a DSLR. The terminology comes from the housing complex in the top of the camera here. There's a mirror system. So when the light comes through the lens, it strikes a mirror inside the camera that's at a 45-degree angle. Light will strike the mirror, project it up to another mirror at a 45-degree angle, which will project it out to the viewer or to the user. And hence the viewfinder here, when you look through a SLR, you're seeing just what the lens sees. So the disadvantage to the rangefinder is you're seeing a separate viewing element than the lens. So what you see is slightly different than what the lens sees through the viewfinding element. With the single lens reflex, it's one and the same. The difference, this is usually a smaller, lighter, easier handheld camera. You can handhold the camera at a lower shutter speed. The single lens reflex, and let me have you listen to what a shutter sounds like. I'm going to do it one more time, cocking the shutter. What you hear is sort of a clunk clunk. And I did that at a 15th of a second so that it would be slow enough that you can kind of hear that. But what you're hearing is the mirror flipping up and out of the way and then back down, allowing, as the mirror flips up, it allows the light to go straight through from the front of the lens to the back of the camera where the digital array is, or in this case, film. So there's an advantage and disadvantage to each. The advantage with the SLR or DSLR is you see exactly what the lens sees. But in doing so with that mirror system, and you hear that clunk clunk of the mirror, it causes what's called in-camera vibration. It causes the camera to vibrate a little bit, and hand holding an SLR or a DSLR at less than a 60th of a second is difficult to do. A rangefinder camera, you can hand hold at slightly lower speeds, and so there's an advantage there in low light situations. If you hear of medium format, they're larger negatives. These are both 35 millimeter cameras. 35 millimeter negative is about an inch by an inch and a half. The size of the negative is pretty much similar today to the size of the megapixel of the camera. Medium format cameras had a larger negative, typically a 2.25, 2.25, in this case 2.25 by 2 5/8. This is a view camera, gives you an even larger negative, generally speaking. 4 by 5, 8 by 10 inch negatives were common. An 8 by 10 inch negative you could contact print without having to enlarge. So all these cameras had their advantages and disadvantages. The ease and lightness of the rangefinder, being able to see exactly what the lens sees of the single lens reflex, the larger negative of a medium format, and even larger negative of the view camera. View cameras, there is no roll film for view cameras, so you're taking individual pictures with that kind of camera. With digital cameras, there's a variety of options, and frankly, there's plenty of different kinds of cameras, and all of us usually even carry a camera around in our pocket with our cell phone, which I don't have listed here. Some basic approaches to cameras, some basic types of cameras. The consumer camera, they're usually simple, easy, cheap, usually have limited controls. They're point and shoot cameras. They usually have fewer file options. They're often a fixed lens. But you can make good pictures with any of these cameras as long as you work within the limitations of what that camera provides. You can do fine with any camera. It's the idea and the execution of the idea that's most important. You have prosumer cameras, which are halfway in between the amateur camera, the consumer camera, and the professional. There are lots of good prosumer cameras out there. You usually have more options and more control with prosumer cameras than you do with consumer cameras. More file types often. There's usually more money as well. If you're looking at cameras, one of the things that you need to consider is, do you want a DSLR or essentially a rangefinder camera, which is a mirrorless camera where your viewfinder is usually an LCD screen rather than a traditional viewfinder. Whatever you're comfortable with and what your price range is one of the things that you're going to have to look at, as well as the megapixels, which we'll talk about a little bit more. If you're looking at buying a camera, I can probably point you in the right direction, but you have a lot of different options, and ultimately the final choice obviously will be yours. Professional cameras usually are more detailed. They're higher number of megapixels, although you can get plenty of megapixels with a prosumer camera as well. Usually have more control, and they're frankly a bit more expensive. Professional camera bodies probably start at around $3,000. Prosumer, you're looking at anywhere from $400 up to about $3,000. In terms of brands, Nikon and Canon are two of the big brands in DSLRs. In terms of mirrorless cameras, there are a lot of brands out there that are good. Sony and Panasonic both make good mirrorless cameras, as do Nikon and Canon for that matter, but there's others. So look at your price range and look at the types of cameras that you might feel most comfortable with. A few basic terms. Shutter release, that's where you take the picture, that's where you snap your shutter. So the shutter release button may be different from camera to camera, and certainly where it appears may be different. Control dials are the ways that you control the different elements of the camera, the ISO and white balance and other kinds of things. We'll talk about that. On the image on the right, you can see an example of a viewfinder. That's a traditional viewfinder where you're looking through and seeing what the lens sees. Many cameras, and mirrorless cameras in particular, use the LCD display as its viewfinder. So whichever you're most comfortable with is fine. They both have advantages and disadvantages. Most of the icons, when you go from Nikon to Canon and others, there's very little uniformity in the icons itself. And so if you can kind of see, that's more or less a universal icon for the display. So if you want to turn on your display, that's generally the insignia that you look for. It's basically a little triangle inside a rectangle pointing to the right. I guess this would be a good description for it. And the trash button is usually a universal icon. But other than that, the icons change from brand to brand. So that's something that you'll have to get used to. And you may want to read through your owner's manual of your camera to have a sense of how some of these work. I used to tell people with 35 millimeter film cameras that I could figure any camera out. And frankly, I could. I'm not so sure I would say the same thing about digital cameras. Sometimes I need to refer to the owner's manual. There's so many different options, and the icons, again, unless you have them all memorized, sometimes it's difficult to assume you know what they mean either. Some of the presets, and we'll talk about these things as we go. The ISO, that's the sensitivity that you give the sensor. The more sensitive the sensor, the more it reacts to light, but the more of the battery it uses. And also usually, not always, but usually if you have a higher ISO and a more active sensor, you also get more of what's called noise. Noise is pixels reacting to electricity rather than to light. And so they're aberrant pixels that don't match the detail of your photographs. Noise, generally speaking, is something to avoid. Usually just a couple different kinds of storage for your digital cameras. Compact flash is larger. It's an older storage system than the SD card. That's what most cameras today use. I've seen some that use a mini SD card that fits inside of an SD card. That's fine too. The number of gigabytes important to know, in that the more gigabytes, obviously, the more pictures they will hold. And indeed, if you shoot at the highest resolution and you have a camera of a decent size megapixel, you'll go through a lot of storage. So you should have at least a few of these cards that you have access to as you photograph. Well, one of the most important features on digital cameras is its resolution. Let's talk a little bit about that. What do I mean by resolution? I'm talking about detail. You can see the image on the top is a low resolution digital image. On the bottom, the high resolution image. With the low resolution image, you see that pixelization. That's a loss of detail in essence. Generally speaking, with a good quality lens, the more megapixels you have, the more pixels you have in the digital array in the back of your camera, and we're talking about millions of pixels. The more pixels you have, the more detailed your final picture will be. That's an important feature in your camera. How are pixels listed, and what is a pixel? Well, a pixel's a digit. It's a square. And essentially inside the back of your camera, you have a digital array which is active to light via electricity. And it responds to the light when the shutter is open that comes through the lens and strikes the array. They're rectangular in shape, and the array may have 2,000 pixels on the short side, the vertical, and 3,000 pixels across on the left. If you have that, if you have 2,000 by 3,000 pixels, and this is one of these things that you'll see when they're selling cameras, they advertise. It's, whatever, and usually the numbers today are bigger than these. But if you had 2,000 pixels crammed into a digital array on the vertical and then 3,000, so you multiply 2,000 by 3,000, what that equals is 6 million. And so that's a 6 megapixel camera. That's an important factor to know, particularly when you're looking at new cameras, to know what the megapixel of the camera is. Let's show you why. When you make a print from your digital file, a paper print or on plastic or glass or metal or whatever you print on, to get a photorealistic looking image, to make an image that looks like a traditional photograph, you need a minimum of 240 dots or pixels per inch. If you see the terms DPI and PPI, they mean one and the same thing. Dots per inch or pixels per inch. DPI, PPI. Anyway, you need 240 dots per inch to maintain an image that looks photorealistic in quality. So if you take that 2,000 by 3,000 pixels of your 6 megapixel digital camera, essentially what you do is you take 240 and divide 2,000 and 3,000 by 240. When you do so, what you find is that at that size, at minimum photorealistic quality, and you might want to print higher than minimum photorealistic quality, get an even sharper, more detailed print. But if you have a 6 megapixel camera, you're limited to 8.3 by 12.5 inches at 240 DPI for that print. because of the number of megapixels of your camera. Most cameras today realistically are 24 megapixels, in that range, well better than what my 2002 state-of-the-art Nikon camera gave me at a 6 megapixel camera. So indeed, things have gotten way better in more recent years. Let's talk about camera menus and settings.